So Randy, I am reading the book, The History of the Robert H. Jackson Center, and in it are pictures of you taking pictures, and also a note that says Randall J. Sweeney, past board secretary, current board treasurer, Chautauqua County native, attended Jamestown Community College, received a degree in business administration from SUNY at Fredonia, 27 years of quality markets, and executive director of the Chautauqua Region Community Foundation since 1997, when he was tapped by Carl Kappa to join that endeavor. Now that little piece of history, I was not aware of a Kappa connection to you and a Kappa connection obviously to the Jackson Center. Tell me about that.
Well, there have been some connection. Obviously, my role at Quality Markets was certainly around sales and marketing a lot of my career there. At the end, I obviously was executive vice president, a little more inclusive of the entire operation, but spent a lot of time in that marketing and PR component. And we had reached out to Crawford, for support, for various activities, with quality in the community. That was one of the challenges that I was given. That was 1986 when I took over the VP of sales role, is to get the quality market name more out in the community rather than just on the front of the buildings. And so we had a not a real close relationship, but we did know each other. And certainly that, by the time I arrived at the Community Foundation, again, there was more opportunities where we crossed paths and talked about things, in the philanthropic world that he was certainly interested in.
So, you being the head of the Chautauqua Region Community Foundation, my prior life as a not-for-profit board member was in that organization. Our paths did not cross. I was significantly over and done with by then, but our paths crossed in many other ways, and one of them was when there was a concept in the nascent years of a Robert Jackson Center for Justice at the time. I talked to you a lot because you were the head of the Community Foundation and the support of that. And do you have any recollections of kind of how that's, because I don't, how that subject sort of worked its way between you and me?
Well, obviously the connection with the Community Foundation, you were well aware the mission of the organization, even today, is to enrich the quality of life in the Chautauqua region. And again, we had funds available to support that mission. And anytime I had pretty much an open door to new ideas. I had joined the organization in 1997. Jackson Center comes along around 2001. It hadn't been too many years had passed, but enriching the quality of life in the Chautauqua region is a very broad mission. And I know when you came to me and started to approach the concept, certainly there were individuals you were interested in talking to that were had been part of or were still part of the Community Foundation world. You mentioned Carl Kappa. Carl was very involved with the early days of the Community Foundation, helped get that off the ground. Betty LeNay's name, came up in our conversations, and Betty at that time was still very involved with the Community Foundation and our day in, day out activities. The same day that I started, Tom Cardman started at the Gebby Foundation as executive director. So Tom and I we were both given challenges at the same time, basically to sort of, not to significantly change the organization, but to enhance it, grow it, see if you couldn't get it more of the community. And so Tom and I had been working together too. So as you begin your efforts, with the Jackson Center, and initially I remember I know you remember this as well as I do, there was no place, there was no center per se. It was Robert H. Jackson the person, and as that evolved, we had some wonderful, memorable moments that you and I will have sitting in the foundation's boardroom with Betty Lene and Carl and signing documents. Unbelievable time. I don't think we appreciated what was happening right at that moment in time, but it was pretty exciting then, and you look back on it now and say, wow.
Well, I really appreciated the fact that from the get-go, you not only encouraged us, but made your facility available, because there was none. And so as we were just conceptualizing, your boardroom became the boardroom as really it was Carl, Betty, you, Phil Morris was there. Just sort of, and the original corporation papers were signed at your table.
Yeah.
And it was terrific. And then we had got incorporated. We actually had an opportunity to purchase a building. I don't know what your reaction was, and I don't think I've ever asked you, when you heard that, hey, Randy, guess what? We have a contract on the Scottish Rite Consistory building, only 19,000 square feet of vacant building that's falling down.
Well, I suppose it was a moment where I, did a double take, but generally speaking, I am generally optimistic about things, and have tried to live my career to always look for the yes and not say the no immediately. The no may come along later, but try to let things evolve. And of course, I really didn't realize your energy right at that point in time for this center. I got to know that over that period of time. If I had, I probably wouldn't have hesitated at all, but it seemed like a mountain, but it didn't seem like an insurmountable mountain. You had a product. Robert H. Jackson. And I personally was as naive as anyone, as the big majority of our local population, about Robert H. Jackson as a person. I mean, yes, we knew very little, but not anywhere near of the wonderful accomplishments of his career. So I think, again, let's go back to that mission of the foundation. The mission is to enrich the quality of life. Well, we already were touting Lucille Ball. We already were touting Peterson, Roger Torrey Peterson, excuse me. And here we had another local boy that done good, and really had not spent a lot of time talking about that. So it was certainly time, because there was definitely a story there, and a story that I had no idea until we got more and more into it.
You had a chance, as we were kind of, again, nascent days, get to know probably Carl Kappa a little bit more. And Carl brought along his younger sister, Jeanette, who you did know. And you get a sense of what Jeanette's kind of early thoughts were about that. I will be interviewing her, but I was curious because you two were pretty kind of glove in hand for a long time.
Well, Jeanette was currently was a board member of the Chautauqua Region Community Foundation at that time, and Jeanette has a strong business finance background, so she thinks pretty much to the numbers. So she was definitely a little more concerned about it all, but if Brother Carl felt it was a good idea, then she was going to do all she could to help any way she could to make it happen. And Carl, I probably was a little more involved than I might have been, but Carl's, I sat in his living room, even before the Jackson Center was thought of, and he asked me, he says, I want to work on one more project, and I think I want it to be downtown, and would you give me a hand? And how do you tell Carl no? You just don't. A lot of people would also tell you about that. I mean, from the thousands of dollars he's raised for the Resource Center and other organizations. So, Jeanette, very, she has a lot of questions. I'm sure that she, when she got back home, she probably wondered what this was all about and whether it would be successful or not.
Also, you had a chance to interact with Betty. Do you remember Betty mentioning this much? I mean, obviously, I had my own conversations with her and conversations at the Scottish Rite Consistory where she sat next to Carl, and I was sort of explaining something without me having any knowledge what the reaction would be. And of course, Carl said he was in, and then Betty kind of tearfully said, "If you're in, Carl, so am I." But do you remember any interplay with Betty?
Well, Betty, from her philanthropic endeavors, liked that piece of the community, which is arts, entertainment, everything they had provided her and Reg at Chautauqua, the Resident Ace Center. But education was always something that she thought was important. And I think she could see through, a lot of that and realize there was stories there about Robert H. Jackson, things he'd done that our community needed to know about. And she was supportive right from the beginning, because we had a lot of lunches together, and there was not a lot of hesitation. She was always supportive of what was going to happen. Obviously, with her support of John Barrett and his fellowship and so forth. So I think she saw that as another one of those components of making this community all it could be, and again, using one of our own along the way.
Dan Bratton. Did you have interaction with him? Dan, president of Chautauqua Institution, came to that meeting at the Jackson's Scottish Rite Consistory, shocked me, saying, "Greg, I'm your executive director," and I didn't even know we were asking. And of course the answer was yes. And then sort of launched for a short period of time. But did you interplay with him much?
Not really. Knew Dan more by reputation, and knew that I was there when he agreed to do that, and realized how important that was. In fact, I was probably as shocked as you were that he agreed. We all were definitely saddened that didn't have that opportunity to tap into Dan Bratton a lot longer, but I know he provided the Jackson Center with some of his insights, and certainly contributed to getting it off the ground.
You were convinced as a original board member, and that I'm sure you had opportunities to say yes and no to a lot of that. Why did you acquiesce to her invitation to be a board member?
Well, we all know, Greg, it's very difficult to say no to you. But going back to, my paying job at the Community Foundation, a nonprofit organization, our area has been blessed with a lot of nonprofits, but I had not experienced the actual birth of a nonprofit from the dust of the earth, and this is what was happening. So for me, it was also an opportunity not only to try to help this thing become, what it is today, but to try to learn on what all goes into a nonprofit organization, and what does it take, to develop the message in such a way that it can survive. I mean, in the 3.5 years or so that I've been at the foundation, I'd certainly learned about the life cycle of a nonprofit, knowing that many times they blast off originally, level off, and then in many cases start a downward slope. So trying to watch all this and try to watch what it takes, and the finance, again, I have an accounting degree, so finances was a little bit the way I grew up through my college education days, and was involved quite a bit of quality markets with a lot of that too. So trying to understand how that all comes together, try to understand what it takes to keep an organization running, especially now you got an organization that has a building, a large building. Many times buildings have become the ball and chain of a lot of organizations, but how are we going to, how is money going to be raised, how the improvements are going to be be made to the building. It was a real learning experience, and as others would come to my door at the community foundation and said, "Hey, I got an idea, and I want to do X, Y, and Z, and I think I can buy or rent this building." I had a little more insight into what that meant and what it took. The Lawson Center up in the Bemis Point area is a good example. When those gentlemen came to me and were so interested in that project, and the person that was basically in your role, similar role at the Lawson Center as president, and I told him, I said, if you're not going to buy in and run this thing for a minimum of 5 years, if not more, then you better have a strong group behind you. And he came back to me in 3 years and he said, I got to get out of this. I said, you can't. I said, you cannot. You got to stick with it. So it was helpful to me to understand how that happens, how it all comes together, and what it takes day in and day out to run a nonprofit organization.
No charge. No. Well, along the way, early on, we had to think about staff, because we were bored. We had some early funding, $500,000 each from Carl, from Betty. Shortly thereafter, a grant from the Gabby Foundation. I didn't fully appreciate that it was an operations grant, what that meant, which was a lot. And then, of course, we had to think staff. Dan passes away shortly thereafter, and we get started. And then we, one of our board members, we looked at one of our board members, Raleigh Kidder. Do you remember that time period?
Well, Raleigh was, again, I had read Raleigh's book. Hadn't met him a few times casually, but didn't know him as well. But immediately we began to realize, how important he could be to the operation as far as his understanding of the world and understanding of politics, understanding the relationships he had. The relationships were so important. As you know, Bill Parment was still in the assembly at that point, and boy, the two of them, that was just such valuable connections, valuable relationships at a time that certainly where there was available funding, and Raleigh, he knew how to, pull the strings in the right places and bring some dollars home to help the facility, because the facility really needed a lot of help. But Raleigh was just fun. We had a lot of fun. We had a lot of laughs. Definitely, made those. He kept those early years, I think, at a even keel too, where his tension level was different than maybe what you and I was, and but that all helped. It all made it happen. It really did. I know we spent a lot of hours with the community foundation's location across the street in Jackson Center. I made a lot of trips back and forth, but again, all great trips back and forth at Prendergast Avenue. Well,
and of course, a significant part of the time, effort, and fundraising was on the building itself, capital fundraising. And Raleigh clearly had a lot of connections, but we also had some help with Don Bloomquist and others who just sort of had a vision of it all. And you were intimately involved in that because you had an ilk towards that construction, how that might work. I did not. So, you added value. Do you remember much about those early meetings, kind of visualizing what could be done, with a degree of financial sustainability? And then, of course, there was some broader brushes as well.
Well, the hardest thing was getting the right priorities. I mean, as you recall, getting the exterior of the building buttoned up with a roof, and as you know, water was running down the inside of the walls instead of the outside of the walls. There were some really serious situations, and trying to make sure that we're getting the right things done. Obviously discovered, issues with the auditorium itself, needed some reinforcements and bringing steel beams in through windows and hoisting them up to support the auditorium. There was some very creative things that happened there. The elevator was another one. Putting an elevator into an old building like that created a lot of challenges. But and I remember the need early on to do something different with that lower level, that basement level, that banquet room. We remember some July events down there that couldn't have been any more uncomfortable, hot, sweaty, and certainly, the floor wasn't safe really, and a lot of work that had to be done there. Certainly, it's Don was so involved with the building because of his interest and certainly his involvement with Don Bloomquist with the Scottish Rite folks that were there. So he knew a lot about the building, or he had ideas about a lot of it, so that was helpful. And Don's just another one of those interesting individuals. I had known Don a little bit through the Community Foundation prior to the Jackson Center, as Don had a lot of ideas on the Chattacoin River and development around the Chattacoin, and he was constantly at my doorstep wanting me to take a ride. We went in places with his car down through narrow dirt pathways that we never should have gone, but we made it down and made it back. So Don was he's just an interesting guy and a great guy, and a guy that would do anything for you once you got to be on his team. So it was interesting to listen to him. Sometimes his ideas were realistic, sometimes not so much so, but he always had a list of to-dos. In the building today, you're never done with an old building. There's always one more project, but certainly can be so thankful that it is in the condition it is today, that especially after this most recent money that came through the DRI to allow those components to be added. I have not been in the building this summer, but I'm assuming they have air conditioning in the mansion, which was probably a pretty enjoyable situation the last few days with this warm weather we've had. But yeah, just thankful for everything that got done.
So, of course, you have the building aspect of it, the capital aspect of it, which Don Blomquist was pretty much in Raleigh, glove in hand, and funding sources with the state. Bill Parma took the lead on all of that. And then there's the kind of the Jackson person component, and we were blessed to have as a board member Harold Adams. What's your remembrance of Harold?
Well, I wish Harold had been my uncle. I mean, you talk about that sweet gentleman, and certainly he had a connection to Jackson that I never would have known. Certainly being there at Nuremberg, with Uncle Bob and
just for the taping of
yeah. With Robert Jackson, just a wonderful gentleman, and certainly had a lot to contribute to the story. And I think, as Dan Bratton had indicated to you, find the stories now, early on, while you can. Stories about Robert H. Jackson, his interaction with the people, that he played with around the world. And Harold was one that had a personal family story of, spending time with the family, and some special times, over dinner, here in Jamestown. But he's one of the most special people that I think I met, And Harold and I found out at that point that Harold had a relationship, with the Community Foundation. He was very much involved with the logo that they use today. He helped design that. So didn't know that either until we were talking one time.
So in addition, with Harold not only being the nephew and personal touch, but he also had archives as well. And so we had to establish a relationship in archive obtaining and archive curating. So we started working with the Fenton. Do you remember Kristen Stein and others like that? Do you remember working with those guys?
Well, a little. I know that you had a thought on how the Fenton relationship might develop, and they certainly were helpful in those early days. It might not have matured completely the way we thought it might have, the potential was there, of course, Kristen was there for a while, and then she left, so there was certainly a change there. So, but I guess I don't remember a great deal that I can contribute for the camera today, you know.
Well, one of the things that just while I'm on the subject, they were very cooperative in sharing their collection. They received a significant collection upon the death of Robert Jackson's daughter, which preceded the center. His mourning coat when he gave the opening address, some of the actual documents that were given when he was appointed as Justice of the Supreme Court. So they have it. And they've shared it with us. Their goal, and still is, I believe, once we are in a position to be certified by the New York State Education Department as a museum, we're not. We're a not-for-profit organization which happens to have archives. Then they would be happy to share with them. Harold Adams wrote a letter encouraging them to do so once that condition is met. So I think that's still out there was sort of the next phase aspect of it. Along the way, Randy, I see you have a book on Eugene Gerhardt, our first event, and that was magic to actually do something, because I think we as the board members, and the board at the time was Raleigh, Bruce, you, Carl had was not Wells, was Jeanette, Willard Cass, and myself, and we talked about doing something quick right away. Just we bought the building in really April of 2001, and we concluded the acquisition of the building. And then we thought we'd do something for Law Day. Do you remember that?
Well, that was May 1st, wasn't it?
May 1st.
I mean, you talk about a fast turnaround. I brought the book primarily because Eugene Gerhardt, for me, was he was one of the first ones that we met from that era. And I know you spent a lot of time with him. I think I went with you one time out to Binghamton and visited with him. But just such a special individual. And, you know, you think about what went into this book. The hours and hours of research and conversations and putting all this together. Certainly a gentleman that had a tremendous love for Robert H. Jackson and respect for him. Just a wonderful guy, and I think we were just on cloud nine. I was, anyways, after that first event, because he certainly brought life to Robert H. Jackson, which I think maybe I needed that, maybe others needed that too, just to you know, get that basic foundation to the person, and certainly with the person that spent so much time, you know, putting all that together.
And what I remember is we're just going to do it 3 weeks. I think we decided, boom, he's coming, bada bang, Law Day, and now we have a basement which was in rough condition, and we sought the help of Bush Industries, Lorraine Melise, who was incredible, and turned that into ice sculpture. I remember all this stuff, like shocking how quickly that turned around. And Fran Galbano, that whole docent group, turned that into a magic event, and then we had an event upstairs, which was our first, and that was our way to honor Carl Kappa, who was in the hospital at that time. Dan could not make it. I don't think he was alive, but he
Sure,
could.
yeah.
So it was really a hurry up to celebrate. We honored Carl that night. The family was all there. So yeah, that was a moment in time. And of course, you had the biographer, the only biographer, showed up at that moment. So yeah, and then we of course have had other big events. Do you have a few that were kind of stand out in your mind?
Well, you know, that's the other part today, looking back on it. There's individuals that would I ever thought that I would have stood next to two Chief Justices of the United States Supreme Court? Never. You know, I mean, and Chief Justice Rehnquist was here, and then Roberts was here, just to mention, you know, a couple. But so much in the civil rights area, I think, was, you know, the Brown versus Board of Education, Mr. Meredith that came. There was so much in that era that Jackson was involved with. Those are pieces, again, of history, but also such a good education for our area and for our kids, for anyone that's interested, certainly in these topics. Robert H. Jackson goes back in a very significant way to a lot of events that happened. And these are things I'll admit I never would have met these individuals, never would have thought about those in my little life here in Chautauqua County, and trying to enrich the quality of life of the Chautauqua region. There's just so many of those. You could go on, and I should have probably researched that entire list. You could mention some, and I know that there would be a story that goes with every one. But so much of it happened and could happen because of all the relationships that got developed over time. And I certainly wanted to mention that. You mentioned that even with this Gerhardt, this first Law Day event, the relationships of businesses, individuals, locally and so forth, that just jumped in, said, I'll help, I can do this. And that's what makes the world go around anywhere.
Well, I think it was wonderful timing because we had an opportunity just had that opportunity, and it was just terrific for us to have the Linda Browns, the James Meredith, the Dorothy Cottons, the John Doors, a variety of people.
Fred Karamatsu is another one that I put very high on my list of, that was an unbelievable event.
Yeah. As you kind of you were on the board for an incredible amount of time, do you get a sense of kind of where we, not only where we are, but where we possibly could be in 5 years from now?
Well, you probably know what I'm going to say, because I've said this several times in the past, that I really feel that the education component was forefront for me right from the beginning, and I still think can be the future of the organization properly developed. I always said I do not have that answer, but there's an education component that has to be brought forward. Now I think I see it a little more through some of the things that is coming from the Jackson Center right now, their little Thursday afternoon teas and so forth. I just think that there's so much that can be brought forward around the world of education, and that's not education necessarily for a elementary student any more than it is education for the adult learner, or just again trying to complement all the other educational places there are for this kind of activity. And I hope that they will continue to develop that. I truthfully think that's going to be if they can develop that component at a point where it really has value, it will help with the funding. And I know that's the other part I've always said. It will definitely help with individuals that are willing to write checks to help support that kind of activity and support the organization as a whole, as they know that they'll be continuing along that pathway and trying to develop more along those lines.
I was struck by Dan's encouragement in the early days, and Michael Barenbaum, who came here who developed the Holocaust Museum. He was part of an early meeting with us and to identify those who knew him. Never appreciated there would be so many people, and that was a goal of myself, was to capture what we're doing now, interviewing those who knew him or were impacted by him, Attorney Generals, Solicitor Generals, Nuremberg prosecutors, Nuremberg participants, going to Nuremberg, all of that in the civil rights program that you mentioned. But it came, there's a logical end to that. Just chronologically, they're no longer among us. It's something that we're thrilled about having captured, but now there is this transition to exactly what you said, and I think that's probably this sustainability aspect of the Jackson Center, is to be able to effectively use what we did, know where we came from, but we got to build off of that, stand on the shoulders. That's always been your vision.
Yeah, I think that's the way to, as I mentioned about the life cycle of a nonprofit, we've all been concerned, you know, the Jackson Center did soar immediately and soared for, you know, we could say 10 plus years. But you do have that plateauing, and you got to make sure that you can figure out how to, and I know we've talked about this at length, how you get that next soar. You know, you plateau, you sort of reorganize, you look at, you still got your strong foundation, but then look for that next level and how to take it there. And that's, I'm hopeful. And again, I can't say it enough, it's relationships. It's really building relationships. As you indicated, a lot of the relationships you build early on, those individuals aren't with us anymore. And thankfully, you spent so much time doing that. For the camera, I'm not sure everybody knows that on a sunny summer Sunday afternoon, when we're all sitting home enjoying, you know, the wonderful weather we have here, Greg, many times you were calling me from the car heading to Cleveland or going here to interview someone. You know, you weren't home sitting on your dock enjoying Chautauqua Lake, but that goes back to the commitment that's needed with the birth of a nonprofit. You just got to keep pounding on it, and you wanted to get everyone interviewed, and I don't know if you've missed too many over that period of time.
Yeah, thank you. I remember there was one clerk who was not able to come here, named Bushman. He lived in New Jersey, and I told my wife on a Sunday morning at 7 a.m., I'm going. I'm going to drive 7 hours. Hope I knew he was there, and just to interview for 1 hour and then come right back. But if I didn't do it, it turned out he died next year. You're right. I enjoyed doing that. I think it's fun. It's part of my DNA, perhaps. But at the same time, I just underscore, and I know Randy, you could comment on some of these folks, but just to think about the John Dalla boys that we had a chance, all the Nuremberg prosecutors, the Whitney Harrises, Henry Kings, the Bernie Meltzers, the people who've come in from the law dialogues, or the chief prosecutors, Ocampo, Bensuda, and never did we have to pay for them. I mean, that's, to me, they didn't treat it as a gig. They came as a support to Jackson.
Yeah, absolutely. And you wonder in their mind, had anyone, and you can answer this better than I can, had anyone talked a great deal about that era in their life recently? And of course, you talk about Whitney Harris and Henry King, you know, who were, you know, they were older statesmen, and no one had really brought that up. And you know, you and I have experienced in other areas that when you bring up these stories, you bring up pieces of individuals past, sometimes they get very excited about it again, and it means a lot to them to realize that someone has all of a sudden realized that they were part of something very special. Father Fuchs, I mean, is another name that became a household name around the Jackson Center, and certainly, again, another story of the bodyguard. You know, I mean, it's just incredible that all those individuals that surfaced. And I think money wasn't the issue with any of them. They just were so delighted, and they felt honored, certainly, to be walking alongside or in the shadow of Robert H. Jackson. They understood how significant he was at that time. Still is today.
Little known about one of the early photographers of Robert Jackson Center was one Randy Sweeney. In fact, there's in the book, Kathy Evans, there's a picture of you with the camera. Yeah, there it is. That's kind of my image of seeing you not only up close, personal, making sure we were on the straight and narrow, but also documenting in a still photography way things that we're probably doing here in a video way.
Well, I always felt that was important. I learned that from someone that told me to make sure that you document things along the way. I know with my kids, I started with scrapbooks from the time they were born to the time they actually finished their college education, and then now I've got the grandkids I'm trying to keep up with. So it's I'd like to go back and look at things that way and remember. Yeah. And certainly been doing a lot of that the last year since my father passed away almost a year ago. I've been trying to go through all the photos, and Spent a good time with this quarantine, sorting through stacks and stacks of my mother's pictures and making 2 sets for my 2 kids, so they've all got those pictures, so for their use.
As I will be launching, you're the first of this kind of retro interviews, and I'll be launching with Raleigh and Carol and Becky and Jeanette. What's the question you want to make sure that I ask them?
Well, I guess I don't have anything that I would think of that you wouldn't ask them at this point in time. I guess I have nothing, particular in mind, so.
As you're driving down here today and knowing that we've done a few of these interviews, what's the question I haven't asked you yet, Randy?
Well, as usual, you cover things pretty well. I guess the Jackson Center Community Foundation relationship, I hoped I was able to move that along in a manner that it was always a little tricky for me as a paid staff member to be a board of a nonprofit, and then there's always those conflict of interest statements that you sign every year. But the Jackson, even though I was in the room many times, or not, many times I stepped out of the room when there were grants being, evaluated from the Jackson Center, the organization stood on its own. I didn't need to be in the room to sell whatever the grant was for. It stood on its own. It had a reputation of doing good things and certainly fulfilling our mission. So it didn't need me to be there. Occasionally I got called back in for more explanation about the grant, but the organization stood on its own during that time frame, and that was important to me because it made it easier for me that I didn't get caught in the middle between a volunteer role I had and certainly the organization that paid my way.
Well, one of the things that we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about, because of your encouragement and support, and gave us credibility, the Community Foundation, because it was long-standing, successful. But we did, you and I did some educational CLE courses, started modestly, but nevertheless it was often you who, we had the idea collectively, but ultimately you were the money of buying food and stuff like that, and most importantly, the publicity, which started off with just maybe a lawyer talking about estate planning, and would be for the bar members, which planted a seed which ballooned into something quite extraordinary.
Well, after a few of them, you realized that we had a good idea here. And for the Community Foundation, we're always looking for, and you just touched on the word estate planning, looking at individuals to remember to leave something as part of their estate to some kind of a charitable activity, using the Community Foundation, hopefully, as a conduit to make that happen. And, if we could position the Community Foundation in the room or in front of local attorneys, hey, that was a home run and a half. So it was a definite marriage at that point in time. And again, we had some staff that certainly could provide a lot of that PR, and to buy some food, those kind of things we would do in a heartbeat. So it was a lot of fun. You managed to put together some very interesting topics. There's pictures of us tie-dye shirts, things of that nature. How those all related, I never was sure. That was outside of my knowledge base, but yes, glad to be part of it. And it led to a lot of other events. I know with individuals, we had some 5 o'clock get-togethers, an opportunity to interview some individuals. Again, I can't keep saying it enough. It's all about relationships, and I certainly looked at it as an opportunity for another relationship building opportunity that you don't get to have unless you try to put yourself there in the right place.
So this is where the video will end, and when we post it, it'll have a picture of Randy Sweeney in a tie-dye shirt with a bandana. going from a button-down tie guy, just what you see him now is rare, because that's the image. He's always dressed to the nines, always had the white shirt, always looked professional. But that day, that one day, he fell off the wagon.
Well, I wouldn't mind if you had a picture of Harold Adams and I either, so I could provide that if you need one.
Well,
That's one of the key things I will always remember from Jackson Center. So.
That and Randy has quite a collection of books that were signed. He really took it very seriously, and he was really a sense of moderation that kept me from who could be overly enthusiastic, not enthusiastic, overly enthusiastic. Just kind of say, "Greg, yeah, that's a great idea. We should probably consider that." I go, "That's a good," and so he provided a wonderful yin and yang here.
But I tell you, there wasn't a lot that you came up with that we didn't try to figure out some way to do it. We always did, one way or the other.
Well, we had a group of people who we built ourselves, and obviously you build yourself around people who think like that. And with the guys like Raleigh and Carroll, and it's just gone on, and the list is endless, frankly. And that is one of the benefits of the Jackson Center, is that we've had, when you look at the list of people who had participated, and in many senses still continue to be interested in us. So they've continued to be engaged, whether it's young readers, that's a whole story unto itself, Warren, the law dialogues, the Chautauqua Institution, that relationship. By the way, I should just have you talk a little bit about John Barrett. He continues to be a major part of us.
Well, I think anyone, if you ask to speak about John Barrett, you talk about someone highly intelligent, certainly a very high standard as far as writing, high standard. As a professor, I know I would probably have difficulty in his class because he has a very high standard, and that's because of Robert H. Jackson in many ways. I know Jackson noted for his writing ability. And John, certainly brings that to the Jackson Center and brought a tremendous amount of credibility. And over time, he developed his own reputation, for the Jackson Center around it. And John and I had a variety of different conversations over time. Certainly, someone that I very much respect, and I'm very thankful that he, continues to. Be an active part of the Jackson Center. He obviously has carried that banner even in recent years, being asked to speak in many places around the country. So I'm glad that he certainly made that relationship with Betty. That was very special early on, and that Betty, the two of them, formed a bond, and that helps provide some support at this point in time.
Brianna, you've listened to this patiently. Do you have any questions you think Randy needs to answer?
No.
Yeah. And the room here is a completed first year, 1L law student from Pepperdine, Brianna Edborn. And she's working on a project which documents many things that Randy has just talked about. So, and we'll have her on camera when she gets done, and still is smiling when she gets done. Thank you, Randy. This is great.
Oh, that's fine. I didn't know. It was good for me just to think about it a little bit, so bring it up again. I hadn't thought about a lot of it in a while, so.